As Michael Crow discussed in his article about institutional differentiation among colleges and universities, understanding similarities and differences across both organizations and groups are helpful for a number of reasons. So, from a research perspective, it can help scholars think about generalizability and whether the findings from any given study can be applied to other contexts. And then from a more practical administrative perspective, contextual dimensions, and especially in particular structures, can be helpful for institutional benchmarking and strategic planning. And that is actually going to be the focus, part of the focus of the activity you'll be completing for this module. I'd like to begin this presentation by defining a bit about what I mean when I say the word structure. So structure refers to basically the design of an organization or a system of organizations. And there are two key attributes within structure. The idea of differentiation, so the notion that organizations or groups are specialized and labor is divided or expertise is divided across these different entities. So differentiation. And then the other dimension of structure is the notion of integration. So then how are all of these differentiated units then coordinated once their labor is divided? So coordination and differentiation really are the backbone of the idea of structure and organizational design. In higher education, the concept of system is applied in two key ways. So first of all, structure is used to describe groups of colleges and universities that are both differentiated but then also integrate together in different ways. So for example, the University of California is a system of 9 different institutions: the University of California at Los Angeles, Berkeley, Riverside, etc. Each of those different institutions have their own chancellors and offer their own degrees, etc. But they're also coordinated by the University of California system, and they're overseen by a single president who is currently Janet Napolitano. So that's the first way in which structure is used in higher education, to describe different systems of organizations and to highlight differentiations within those different organizations. Then also, structure is used to describe any given individual organization's design. So an obvious example, which is up here on the screen, would be different organization charts, right? So ways in which, again, labor or specializations of individual roles are differentiated and then coordinated and controlled in terms of the reporting structures and communication lines. But in higher education, in addition to org charts or organizational designs in terms of roles and responsibilities being an example of structure, structure can also refer to procedures such as evaluation. So tenure is a structure at many institutions, and other policies. Governance structures is another good example in higher education. So faculty senates, for example, or unions are other structural attributes of certain organizations. And all of those are important things to take into account when thinking about your post-secondary context where you were working and studying. Because really, the organizational structures of American colleges and universities do vary distinctly, depending on their institution type, culture, and history, but they also share much in common, right? So you have to think about, the authority structures, so how are leadership positions distributed, and are there governing boards, a president or chancellor, what types of administrative positions exist, the academic senate, etc. So these are important things to be thinking about, the structures of your organization, both in terms of your individual organization as well as how it's fitting into the larger system of U.S. higher education. So there are a few concepts and terms I want to make sure that you understand related to the basic structure of colleges and universities. First is the notion of institutional control. So essentially that refers to the extent to which the state, both federal and individual state governments, are involved in the decisions that are made within any given college or university. So essentially that's the technical term for the different types of institutions when we refer to public institutions, private, not-for-profit institutions. So examples of that would be Harvard University, and then also private for-profit universities. So an example of that local to Arizona would be the University of Phoenix or Grand Canyon University. So that's the notion of institutional control, and that's a structural characteristic, right? Another related structural characteristic of colleges and universities are their levels, right? And so essentially that refers to what types of degrees they award to students. Some award degrees to bachelor's degrees and higher. So essentially in the United States, those are 4-year degrees and higher. And then some are 2-year degrees, but they don't award 4-year degrees like bachelor's degrees. And so those institutions are 2-year institutions, also known as community colleges or technical colleges. And then some post-secondary institutions in the United States more focused on workforce training and certificate programs, and they don't award associate's degrees or bachelor's degrees, but instead certificates that are considered to be less than 2-year. So that is the idea of institutional level, related to the types of degrees and levels of degrees that schools award. And then finally is the notion of institutional sector. And essentially, this is pretty easy, it's the combination of the prior two structural characteristics. So when we say Arizona State University is a public 4-year institution, that refers to ASU's institutional sector. Another structural characteristic that is very particular to U.S. higher education is the Carnegie Classification. So you read about the Carnegie Classification in the McCormick article that was published in Change magazine a few years ago about the redesign in 2005, as well as some of the history and context behind that classification. And also, part of the assigned activity for this module will involve learning and working with the Carnegie Classification further. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the Carnegie Classification, but I do want to highlight that one of the key purposes of this classification has been to assist those conducting research on higher education. And that's partially why I think it's a really valuable tool for you to know about and learn about, because researchers really do need a way to reference the great diversity of colleges and universities in the United States. And just using sector, control, and level are not sufficient to create groups of comparable institutions, right? So it's also useful for university leaders, such as yourselves, many of you, hopefully, in terms of benchmarking and comparing your institution to others. One of the byproducts of the Carnegie Classification that McCormick talks about is that it's actually been used or co-opted by institutions to create a status system within the United States where research universities are often considered to be the highest status type of institution, and many schools have strove to change their Carnegie Classification in terms of thinking that higher or a different classification, not higher, I'm sorry, I'm falling into this status trap, a different classification might signal more status. But really the primary purpose of Carnegie Classification is really about research and benchmarking. So while the Carnegie Classification, again, is not intended to rank colleges or universities, there are indeed many systems in place that purport to do just that. So they've been devised by newspapers and magazines across the country and the world, indeed. So some examples are on the screen, as well as by academic institutions. So there are several universities in China that have released or annually release academic rankings of world universities, as well as different NGO, non-governmental organizations that try to get at different dimensions of quote unquote what's better or higher quality or sort of higher status in terms of different characteristics of institutions. So again, although rankings aren't actually a structural characteristic, they are often associated with structures, and they are a great way to help you make sense of your individual institution's context as well as benchmark. Certainly, however, there are a number of critiques of how these rankings are devised and used. And so, one of the optional articles associated with this module focuses on the US News, World, and Report ranking system and sort of unpacks that a little bit more. So, if you're interested in rankings, I highly encourage you to read that article. It's actually very interesting. Related to the structure of any given individual college or university, there are a few other dimensions that I'd like to highlight. So the first, and I'm conceptualizing this especially from my standpoint as a scholar who focuses on faculty and academics in my research. So how knowledge is organized within any given college or university is an important and meaningful contextual characteristic, at least from my vantage point in terms of studying faculty and their careers and their work lives. And so, as Becker said in his article, sometimes researchers should focus on a single discipline, other times on groupings of disciplines. So that's something, if you're studying questions or thinking about problems related to academics, you need to be really cognizant of describing which fields you're focusing on and why, and which ones are related and why you can make the case to combine different disciplines or keep them separate, etc. So the Becker article does introduce a number of different schemes for thinking about how to organize the disciplines within any given college or university. So that's a helpful model. Something else, the other article that I had you read for this module was published by the president of Arizona State University, who has, as you now know from the article, undergone a major reorganization of how knowledge is structured within Arizona State into this new American university model. So rather than having schools and colleges organized around the traditional disciplines, as many other institutions do that, he has tried to identify major issues within society that require focused research and bringing faculty and scholars together around those different social issues. And so that's the new American University model. And if that was interesting to you, that article, I encourage you to check out ASU's website because he's actually introduced additional structures around sort of other knowledge-related problems since publishing that article. So that's one important dimension to be considering related to the internal structure of different colleges and universities. Another dimension of internal structure that often varies across different colleges and universities is how their administrative functions are organized. So some examples of those important activities are listed above on the screen. At some institutions, advising might be centralized in a university-wide office, or at some institutions, perhaps it is decentralized to the different academic units. So understanding how those administrative functions are structured within your context is really important, especially when those are the focus of whatever your problem of practice is. So for example, let's say you were doing a study of an academic advising office. It would be important to describe how academic advising fits within the larger university structure. So is it a unit perhaps housed within the provost office? Is it housed within student services? What kinds of responsibilities do professional academic advisors have? Are there any responsibilities that faculty have related to advising, etc.? So that's how to think about where individual institutional structural characteristics are important within your dissertation context. So if you're doing a study of financial aid, you wouldn't be talking about how the advising office fits into the college or university, obviously, and you might not even be concerned with discipline or academic organization. It really depends on what your research question is and your problem is in terms of what kinds of structures you should focus on in describing in your dissertation. So again, up on the screen, what matters depends most on what you're doing. Another great way to think about this is from maybe a peer's perspective who works at a different college or university. What characteristics of your program or the context that you're doing your research on would matter most to a colleague somewhere else who's trying to figure out if your advising office is equivalent enough to theirs? So I'd like to conclude this presentation with a few examples of how structure can be really useful to research studies. First of all, in any study, including your action research dissertation, you should have a subsection within your methodology that describes the setting for your work. So that's where structural characteristics such as control, level, type, Carnegie type, even things like internal structures related to whatever your particular research question is, will be important to explain further to readers. In addition to having a description of your setting, structure can also be really useful as a rationale for sampling institutions to participate in any given study. So I'm going to use an example from my own research. Here is a paper that I published in 2012 that was a study of 15 institutions in a state system of higher education. And so my co-authors and I ended up using Carnegie type, so that's a structural characteristic, right, to describe our participating institutions, as well as to decide to exclude certain institutions from participating. So in particular, there were 15 institutions in the system, but 6 were medical schools. And so because we decided that the focus of our study was on faculty careers, and we believe that faculty in medical schools and those types of institutions have very different experiences than others at doctoral research universities and master's institutions. So we opted to exclude the responses of the faculty from the medical schools from that particular type. So structure can be really useful in deciding how to sample institutions and which institutions are relatively comparable versus not comparable. The structure can also be really useful in describing the possible limitations of your research. Any empirical study should have at least a short discussion of cautions that the reader should be aware of or potential limitations that the reader should be aware of when using and interpreting the results of a study. So I use structure to define some of the limitations of the study that I used as the example on the previous slide as well. The text is here up on the screen. So as you can see, I talked about how we used the Carnegie type of Masters 1 institutions as well as doctoral institutions in our regression analyses. However, we decided for parsimony to include both the doctoral research intensive institutions and extensive institutions in one variable, and we compared them to master's institutions. We did something similar for discipline, another structural characteristic, right? Faculty's disciplinary affiliation. So as we discussed in our limitations section, by combining different disciplines together and by combining these institution types, we might be masking unique effects that might be associated with their campuses as well as their disciplines. And so we also made an acknowledgement that the findings in our study are representative of faculty employed, tenured and tenure track faculty, which is a structural characteristic, right? Employed at four-year institutions, the level of institution, which is another structural characteristic, in a single state system of higher education, and may not reflect circumstances in other systems or geographic regions. All of those are structural characteristics that were useful in describing potential limitations to making generalizability about our findings. So hopefully this has given you a good sense of different structural attributes of college and university systems as well as individual organizations that can be applied to both your research projects as well as your practice.